I have basically an A to Z talk. The bulk of these plants I'm talking about tonight are plants I've developed, whether it's through hybridizing or selecting or finding sports. Um, but I will talk a little about the background of the plant as well, if it makes sense. But my breeding is kind of focused on plants that are durable, long-lived, somewhat trouble-free in the gardening arena. I started growing perennials in 1991, right out of college, and we were growing a lot of things that were kind of not long-lived or acting almost like annuals or just not quite hardy. And so I moved away from those plants, kind of coming into the 2000s. And then now, after 2000, the kind of the Dutch wave and the naturalistic gardening kind of form of gardening and style of gardening became more and more popular. And a lot of these plants fit that kind of palette and that look and that type of gardening. So these things kind of gelled both with my personal choice and with the demand and the kind of new style and new not only types of gardens but demand for plants. So just a little more about my background. I grew up in Glenview, Illinois, a suburb of Chicago, where my dad had a garden center. Before that, he had a landscape business in Evanston for 10 years. And then my mom also had a florist. So we really were kind of surrounded by plants and flowers and taking care of plants from the time I grew up. And we worked in delivering flowers for my mom's flower shop. I worked in landscaping for my dad, partly through college. I also did an internship at Radke Perennial Nursery in Germantown, Wisconsin. That was very informative and important in my learning and kind of focus on growing perennials for the wholesale end of the trade. So selling business to business, garden centers, landscapers, public gardens, private gardens, golf courses, municipalities. That's kind of the bulk of our customer base. We also sell to other growers. And then with the plants I'm developing, I am working with and licensing other people to grow my plants, not just in the Midwest, but throughout the country and a few throughout the world. We have plants being grown in Australia, Korea, Europe, Kenya, Guatemala, Israel, some in Japan even. So, that all takes time and effort, but it's cool to see a plant you've developed in Hebron, Illinois, going to not just other gardens, other people's homes, but other countries and other markets. So yeah, let's jump into the plants. Allium's Big Beauty is kind of my take and my not necessarily improvement on Summer Beauty, which is quite popular in the Midwest and really heavily used for good reason. It's a great plant. It has that deeper green glossy foliage. But I thought the fact that Big Beauty has this wide kind of grayed green foliage was quite stunning when I found it as a seedling. This is part of a breeding program. So in the case of alliums, mostly the bees are moving the pollen from plant to plant. But I have kind of controlled plants that I'm collecting seed on. So one of the parents has this very wide kind of glaucous or silvered foliage, almost up to an inch wide. And so it's quite substantial compared to a lot of the other alliums, which are thin-leaved or green or silver, or maybe more on the green side. So this one, again, was really selected for that beautiful spring emergence in the foliage. And then the flower color and kind of presentation was quite similar to Summer Beauty. It's kind of that lilac pink, light pink is how I kind of see it. And before they turn pink, you kind of get a silvering to white in the bud. And compared to Summer Beauty, the flowers are just a little bigger. They're also a little taller as far as their stature in the garden. So Summer Beauty is going to be maybe more 15, 18 inches. This one's going to be 18 to 20 plus. And maybe just a little earlier than Summer Beauty as well. So more July as opposed to July, August. Aster Thunderdome. This is a newer creation of mine. This is a hybrid between the New England aster, which has that purple flower color, and the aromatic aster, which typically have blue flowers, but they have different foliage. They have more fragrant, um, thinner and cleaner, kind of more disease resistant foliage. A lot of times on these New England asters, you'll get browning or kind of the foliage doesn't look that great by the time the plants are starting to flower in September. So the cross kind of gave the plant hybrid vigor, and we got the nice purple color from the New England type. And then we got that nice fragrant foliage from the aromatic Aster oblongifolius. And the combination is, again, quite nice because with that fragrant foliage, you get some deer resistance, hybrid vigor. These plants are quite big in the garden. They're growing 3 foot plus, maybe even up to 4 feet tall. They still have somewhat of a dome shape to them, but they're not like Purple Dome, which is like a 2 foot mounding shape. It's more of a larger, more open dome shape to it. And these are going to bloom in late summer, so really late August, September into October. And here it is on trial at Iowa Arboretum. As a breeder, we typically are sending trial plants throughout the country, mostly to other growers and propagators, but also to some public gardens, including Chicago Botanic Garden. They, for the most part, have all of my introductions of recent timing anyway. This isn't necessarily overly new, but it might be new to you. Butylua gracilis is a grama grass, it's called, and these are native to the Midwest. There's one in the trade called Blonde Ambition that comes from the southwest of the US, more like New Mexico, and it has yellow flowers. And it's a beautiful looking plant, but it's not quite hardy in our Midwest winters and our heavy soils. So I bred this one, which is a hybrid with Blonde Ambition and our native Midwest ecotype. And the result was kind of a similar size and statured plant to Blonde Ambition, which is nearly maybe twice as big as is typically found in wild. In the wild, these are typically around 18 inches tall. This one's going to reach 24 to 30 inches tall, with nearly a cloud of these kind of vertical to kind of angled and sometimes horizontal flowers. They look like little eyelashes when you get close up, and the flower can actually have a little yellow to it, but as they age, they're more on the tan side. So the pollen is yellow and parts of the flower are kind of lighter colored, but as they age, they deepen a little. The nice thing about honeycomb is it's more adaptable for a Midwest garden and conditions. So um, wet winters, heavier soil, this plant's gonna do fine in that type of situation. Where typically it's found growing in kind of dry or gravelly soil. The species would be anyway. Carex humilis hex is new to me. So kind of coming into the market, my mentor, Roy Diblick, is starting to use a lot of this item, and we started growing it last year. I saw it at a few different places looking really nice. I saw it at Denver Botanic Garden, saw it at Northwind, here with Lamium under some hydrangeas in kind of dry shade where there's no irrigation, real deep green, fine foliage, long-ish. So each blade is going to be over a foot long. And so with that, you kind of get a pretty substantial spread and coverage. These are low plants, just maybe 6-8 inches tall. I haven't seen anything substantial as far as inflorescence or flowering. So it's really just primarily a good ground cover, good kind of shady matrix plant where you can weave in other shade plants, whether it be native forms or non-native forms. Roy's using a lot of ferns with his carex plantings. He's doing many big carex plantings with kind of ferns sprinkled in lately. Coreopsis tripteris is a typical species of Coreopsis or tick seed found in the prairie. But in the case of flower tower, this was found at a nursery and it is a tetraploid form of our native Coreopsis. And what that means is the chromosomes are doubled. And because of that, the whole plant is more substantial altogether and bigger. So this plant reaches kind of average 7 feet tall or taller in the garden. The stems are nearly an inch wide at the base. The leaves are maybe twice as big as the species and quite substantial just on their own. So I love that kind of presence in the garden. I also like its late flower timing. It's kind of August into September. It's a pretty bright golden yellow, I would call it. Lots of flowers, good for pollinators as well. And just the habit is quite upright. No real relaxing in the garden on this one. This plant you see, this is at one of our gardens at the nursery, and I think it's been in that garden nearly 20 years. Great plant. I have some at my own house too, along the fence, and it kind of blooms with a late flowering aster called Jindai, which is a nice kind of combination. Eryngium yuccifolium is another native prairie species, but in the case of prairie moon, we selected a shorter form, and we only grow this shorter form. Typically in the prairie, these plants are getting kind of 5-foot average in height. This one only grows 3 feet tall. It's also a little finer in foliage. It's also a little bluer than typical species. Some of them verge on green, some are kind of blue-green. This one's quite blue in foliage. And besides that, highly attractive to pollinators, and very drought tolerant. This one grows just 3 feet tall, and we have it all over the nursery in gravel gardens, typical normal gardens, but it's virtually static. It kind of looks the same and long-lived, trouble-free, kind of from the time it starts to flower in July to fall. In fall, they start to turn brown. They're not so white, but that white flower is showy for a couple months before they start to turn brown. And they will stand up all winter in the garden. I'm usually collecting my own seed, so I don't always get to see that, but just like echinaceas and some alliums, they have nice presence in the winter and nice winter interest. Eupatorium maculatum Jojo. This is a friend of mine found this. He's a grower of native plants. In the case of Jojo, it has like a double flower. So it's kind of missing the pollen. So maybe not great for pollinators, but because it doesn't really have those flower parts, it is longer blooming, probably gonna look the same for 2 to 3 months in the garden. It's also a little more reserved in the garden, more around 4 feet tall. And then real nice kind of mauvey pink color as well. Eupatorium perfoliatum is a wetland native species of Eupatorium. And many years ago, I found some red leaf forms in Fontana where I live in a wetland. So I collected some seed. I took that back to the nursery. I grew out seedlings and I kind of selected one that I grew for many years called Milk and Cookies. Milk and Cookies was more in size and in line with the species, more like 3 feet tall. Typical foliage size and habit in the garden. And then we started breeding and selecting for improved forms that had maybe darker or darker foliage, more black foliage, and or maybe hybrids that potentially had more pink in the flower. This one, I wasn't quite sure if it was a hybrid. It did seem to have bigger size to it, and larger foliage. And one year it kind of had pink in the flowers. It definitely has pink when it goes to seed, but compared to Milk and Cookies, it's just a more substantial plant altogether. When it emerges, it has this kind of dark purple foliage, converge to kind of chocolatey brown or purple. And then as it starts to bud and flower in July, August, the foliage kind of lightens, but you typically still have some dark purple on top of deep green foliage. And then you have a creamy white flower, strongly attractive to pollinators, typical of the species, but the plant is just a little more vigorous. So these are going to grow more like 4 to 5 feet tall in the garden. They don't need moist soil, but they will grow in moist to wet soil. Average soil is fine as well. And then this one is actually a hybrid with the Eupatorium perfoliatum. In the case of polished brass, it has kind of brassy foliage as it emerges. And then by the time it starts to flower in July, August, the foliage starts to green up, but it still has that gloss to it. It's a creamy white or kind of bone white flower, but very vigorous plants. The picture on the right is at the Lavin Evaluation Garden at Chicago Botanic Garden. And this plant is 5 foot tall. and nearly flowering all the way to the ground. And that's maybe 4 or 5 plants planted together in a 6-foot bed. So you can kind of see the flower power of the plant. And then on the picture on the left, this is not doctored. This is a picture with 3 monarchs and another moth on there. I'm sure there were some other flies or wasps or bees on that plant at the same time. Yeah, I see honeybee actually over top left corner as well. So strongly attractive to pollinators as well. Almost shrub-like in the garden, gets so big. Our native woodland geranium maculatum, is a great woodland plant. In the case of Huggy Bear, you can actually grow this one in full sun or part shade. This one has a little larger foliage, and then the color is this kind of chocolatey red or brown. So leaf-wise, it gets about 5 inches wide. These are also more disease resistant than some of the other red forms on the market. So that foliage looks good and clean from spring to virtually all the way to fall. It does still have that nice clear pink flower in May. The foliage is only going to be around 12 to 15 inches tall and wide. And then the flowers are going to be up above that, maybe 18 to 24 inches wide. And those are going to bloom in May. There it is, with that deep foliage in the background. We grow a lot of different hostas. I know if you have deer, it's kind of a it's hard to even go there. I have deer in my front yard. In my backyard, I fence it. So I do have a small hosta collection in my backyard. These are just 2 of the newest kind of miniature hostas that we've started growing. This one, Party Streamers. I can hardly see the name because of the zoom controls on my screen, but Party Streamers is that wavy, thin gold foliage, pretty bright throughout the whole season, spring, summer into fall. I thought it was, and seems to have very good vigor as well. I'm not a big ruffled hosta foliage fan on these larger ones, but I think for the thin leaf forms and the smaller forms, it adds a lot to the kind of texture and the look of the miniatures. And then moving from gold, more of the blue side is this silly string. Silly string is more powder blue to nearly silvered. It has that nice purple in the stem, heavy lavender flower as well. These pictures were taken at the new shade evaluation garden at the Botanic Garden called Shada Garden, something like that. But it's a cool new garden to go see. They're doing lots of hellebores, which would be worth visiting right now. Lots of Carex trials in that garden, as well as a lot of the heucheras on the market are in that garden. And then some other shade plant trials going on, like pulmonaria and things like that. So mature size is only going to be around a foot wide, short in stature except for the flowers. Ligularia is another good shade plant. This one's Treasure Island. This is a hybrid between dentata, which a lot of old varieties were like Othello and Britt Marie Crawford, which is still a great plant if you can find it. With Treasure Island, it has that kind of rhubarb red stem, like dentatas typically do. It has that deeper green color. but the new foliage is a little brighter. So you get kind of a bicolor green effect in the garden. You have good vigor. And then you do have a kind of golden cluster of flowers on about 4-foot stems. The foliage on this plant is only going to reach around 2 to 3 feet tall. And maybe 2 to 3 feet wide in maturity in the garden as well. These will benefit from moisture and rich soil. My dad used to plant Ligularia the rocket in pure peat moss, and he would have a plant that would have 75 flowers, would be over 6 feet tall, 6 feet wide on one plant. So putting these plants in the right kind of conditions can make a big difference. Millennia is kind of a more of a landscape grass. It's not typically used in a lot of gardens, but I think it's potentially up and coming. Some of these tall forms like Dark Beauty have this real see-through habit where the stems are kind of 7 plus or minus feet tall, but the foliage is down more along the 2-foot size and range. So you get this real airiness to it and kind of see-through effect. And in the case of Dark Beauty, this is selection that Pete Udolph made, and we are one of 2 propagators in the United States bringing it to market. So in the case of Dark Beauty, it has a purpled stem. The bulk of the millennials on the market are either green if they're tall, or if they're purple stems, they're short. So this is one of the first with a dark flower and dark stem on that tall Millennia arundinacea habit, which are these types that are kind of 6 feet or 7 feet or sometimes 8 feet tall in flower. Vase-shaped habit. So on top, they might be 4 feet tall in the garden, or I'm sorry, wide. And on the base of the plant, they're still only going to be a couple feet or less wide at the base. They're pretty strongly clumping plants altogether. And if you want something a little more reserved, we have one called Dutch Dreamer. This one's more 5 to 6 feet tall. Fall color is more on the yellow side as opposed to kind of a golden orange color, typical of some of the other forms. You can see the kind of form of the plant going into fall and winter on the left side, and then fall color on the right side. A little more upright than vase shaped in this case. Monarda bradbriana is a great species from the Ozarks. And in the case of bradbriana, it can be quite variable. So sometimes the leaves are kind of matte or fuzzy and are green. Sometimes they're glossy. Sometimes they're purple or reddish when they emerge. And so because there was that wide variability, I decided to look at my kind of range of seedlings and select for better forms. And in my case, I was selecting for forms that had cleaner foliage, less disease pressure, especially in propagation. So we will propagate these from cuttings. We take a cutting with no roots, we put it in soil under mist. So they're getting misted constantly. And some of those forms couldn't take it. They would get diseased or they would rot out. And in the case of bradbriana midnight oil, this one had better adaptability to moisture conditions, heavier soil, just less disease pressure altogether. So I didn't have to spray any herbicides and I wasn't losing plants in propagation. So on the left, you can see the foliage as it's kind of maturing, where it goes more olive green and glossy. But when it emerges in the spring and sometimes going into fall, it will be this chocolatey red foliage. Compared to other Monardos, this one's earlier and smaller in stature. These bloom in June as opposed to the bulk of the other Didyma types are July blooming. They're also smaller plants altogether. So typically about 18, maybe 24 inches tall and wide. They can spread in the garden by seedlings or by rhizomes, but they're mostly clumping or slowly spreading plants in the garden. On the right, you can see the flower color is a light pink. They do have kind of wine purple or red spots on top of that pink petal. And then after those petals are gone, you have a nice kind of greenish or purplish and eventually brown cone, which will last throughout the entire winter. So lots of interest from the time it starts to emerge in April, May to all the way through winter with the seed heads. And on the right, also with that picture, it's planted. This is a planting we have at the nursery with Carex pennsylvanica. Makes a real nice combination. Can go into light shade, part shade, but we grow it in full sun. Seems to have a little better vigor in more sun, but tolerates dryish part shade. There we go. Muhlenbergia cuspidata is a prairie satin grass. So as grasses go, this one's maybe a little less showy when it comes to kind of ornamental qualities. But what I do love about the plant is it's quite static. It's very fine textured. It's almost like a miniature little blue stem. So very almost wire-like stems with thin kind of gray green foliage. On the left, this is the plant kind of going into mid to late summer as it's starting to relax. On the right, you can see a little yellow fall color. The flowers are almost inconspicuous on this plant. It's really about the texture and the clumping size of it. Kind of the mature size in the garden is going to be about 12 to 15 inches tall. And then they kind of relax and lay down in the garden as you go into late summer. And with that foliage kind of laying down, covering the ground, you're going to have a kind of an 18-inch or more spread. Kelly Norris kind of teased that this was like a tinsel in the garden. It's so fine. And I love that idea of something that fine in the garden. What else about this plant? Strongly clumping, very drought tolerant as well. Long-lived, trouble-free. We have it in our gravel gardens, and it's been in there for closing maybe even over 20 years now. Muhlenbergia cuspidata. This is kind of a central plains native grass, but it's proving to be very adaptable. Seems to be tolerating Pacific Northwest conditions. I saw it in Colorado. This is at the Chicago Botanic Garden. I saw it in Minnesota. And the plant very much looks the same from climate to climate and area to area. It's a pretty substantial plant. These are going to be about 3 feet tall, nearly 4 feet wide. The beauty of it is that kind of late pinkish purpled inflorescence in the garden. The closest thing you could maybe see it equating it to might be prairie dropseed, but prairie dropseed doesn't have that beautiful pinky purple color to it. This is maybe a little finer and a little fuller as well. But I think it has a lot of use both as a specimen or in mass planting. Here are some pictures. Top middle is in Denver. Bottom left is in Minnesota. Bottom right, Chicago Botanic Garden. And this was all seen last year, either September, October. Nepeta Blue Prelude. So this is a hybrid with a nepeta called Siberica. And so these are not your typical kind of catmint where they're a little mounding plant. These are pretty substantial, really nice lavender blue color. But the plants are going to be about 2 feet plus tall in the garden and nearly 2 feet wide as well. Get these beautiful blue flowers, probably attractive to hummingbirds or for sure other pollinators, and quite long blooming. These are going to bloom a month and a half to 2 months in the garden, kind of going maybe mid to late June, July into August, depending on heat of summer and conditions. Real nice bright green foliage as well. If you like oreganos, this is an ornamental oregano. It has almost like a little cone to it, kind of that pinky purple or purpley pink, you might say. There's a little hint of almost silver or white in it as well. The foliage is kind of silvered. These are strongly drought tolerant, make good container plants, would work nice as an edging plant, or as you can see here, tucked in with boulders or stones. They're only going to be around 8 to 10 inches tall, but with spread, they're going to go 15 inches or more in the garden. These are going to start to bloom kind of mid-summer and carry into late summer. Panicum Dust in the Wind is one of my new introductions. I've been working kind of on purple and red panicums for fall color and leaf color. In the case of Dust in the Wind, it's more kind of a smoky purple, but you get those highlights starting in the spring. So it's hard to see in this picture, but those tips on the left are kind of purpled, and those purpling started in the spring of the season. They hold on through summer. So that purple is kind of on top of an olive green color, a real kind of upright 5-foot looser habit compared to many of the other upright panicums. And then by late August, September into October, the whole plant will turn this kind of smoky purple or grade purple color. And on top of that, you have red seed heads, good habit to 5 feet tall, and more or less upright in habit, except for some of that arching foliage. Phlox Mr. Blue Sky is a hybrid we created at the nursery. My protege Jake bred this one. It's a hybrid between Phlox pilosa, which is the sand phlox. And we had a blue form called bungalow blue. We took that bungalow blue and we crossed it to a Phlox divaricata, which is the woodland phlox, shade tolerant and native. And the result was this kind of lavender blue, spring blooming, May blooming, short in stature, early phlox. And if you look close, you can see blue in the bud. If you cut the flowers, you bring them inside, they will turn blue. But outside in sunlight, they're more of this lavender blue with kind of blue in the background, depending on temperature and light. These will grow in full sun. Most likely are going to tolerate hard to light shade, no problem either. Just around a foot tall in stature, maybe 15 inches in maturity. So about a foot tall and wide in size. Pycnanthemum Smoky Mountain Mint. This is a new hybrid of mine. Pycnanthemum incanum is the parent. And incanum is kind of upright to about 30 inches, has kind of green and silvered foliage combination. In the case of Smoky Mountain Mint, it has that silver foliage on top where the flowers are, almost like a bract surrounding the flowers. And then below that, you get this smoky purple foliage. It's almost like a cake where you have silver on top of the plant, and then below it, you have this purple smoky foliage underneath it. It's also a little more reserved in stature. So instead of 30 inches tall, it's more around 24 inches tall. It is going to be spreading rhizomatously like some of the pycnanthemums, maybe not quite as aggressive, but it is going to be a spreading plant. If you're not familiar with pycnanthemums, these are highly attractive to native pollinators, wasps, moths, bees, butterflies probably too. Very highly attracted to this plant, and almost all the pycnanthemums. The common names are mountain mints, and then there's all different forms. Many of the forms have thin foliage, but muticum and incanum have this broadleaf foliage. We've had a handful almost rudbeckias on the market. One of them is called American Gold Rush. That was an award-winning black-eyed Susan. If you're not familiar with it, you should look it up. It's quite the plant. It's not necessarily new, so I have taken it out of this talk, but this is a kind of a sister seedling. Green-eyed Lady has that more green cone when it emerges, then it kind of verges on yellow as they open and mature, nearly not quite matching the petal, but playing off the petal very nicely. So it's almost like a green on green or a yellow on a yellow. In the case of Green-eyed Lady, these plants are 30 inches tall and very kind of upright in habit. The foliage is low to the ground and little kind of basal mounds. So it's a little different habit than is typical of black-eyed Susan, but this one's very drought tolerant. It is kind of a new color. It's more to the yellow side as opposed to the gold side of things. The bulk of black-eyed Susans are on that gold to almost orange side of things. And then similar to Green-eyed Lady is Sweet as Honey. This one's nearly half the size, so more 15 to 18 inches tall in the garden and smaller altogether. The flowers are only going to be about 2 inches wide, but each stem has like a little bouquet. So 7, maybe 9 flowers per stem. And again, it's on the yellow side of things. So you have these smaller black-eyed flowers with bright yellow petals and real beautiful kind of bouquet type presentation in the garden. Very drought tolerant, makes a good container plant compared to, you can kind of see the habit here. These are some container plants at the nursery. Sanguisorvas are quite popular in Europe. There may be 50 plus varieties in Europe. These are very commonly used in that naturalistic type gardening. And so we've been growing and kind of looking at a 5 or 10 in the last 10 or 15, maybe 20 years. And I decided to make an intermediate form. So we were already growing one called Tana that was 2 feet tall. We were growing Tenuifolia purpurea, which was 5 feet tall. And I took those 2 plants and I crossed them. And the intermediate plant became plum drops. Plum drops has that chocolatey red flower, but lots of them, a little smaller in stature or maybe intermediate if you look at the parents. Tana has more of a button type flower. Tenuifolia purpurea has a long chocolatey red, maybe 3 to 4 inch flower. This one's kind of in between. So maybe an inch to inch and a half, sometimes maybe 2 inches, sometimes a little more ball shaped, but lots of them. The bulk of these are kind of mid to late summer flowering as well. They can be used as a cut flower. In the case of plum drops, the plant with the kind of wiry stems grows around 3 to 4 feet tall, maybe closer to 4 because of hybrid vigor. But these things, because of that thin stem, they almost look like they're floating from a distance. And they make real nice combinations with that late summer garden that is so typical of that naturalistic and Dutch wave type gardening scenario. Great with fall grasses, especially the taller grasses, where it kind of makes a good background to this plant. The foliage is also very nice on this plant. It's almost like a herringbone or a fishbone, where you have that kind of scalloped edge and pinnate pattern. I've been working on little blue stems and lots of different grasses over the years. This one was new last year. It's one of my favorite new plants of my work and my breeding. Little red fox is a smaller statured little blue stem, so more 24 to 30 inches tall. It has a more reserved habit too. A lot of that foliage is basal, so it's maybe 8 to 10 inches, maybe 12 inches tall. It almost is like a little skirt. And then through that skirt, you get these wiry stems that have both silver and blue in them. And then when they go to flower and they start to fall color, you'll get red and purple on top of silver and blue. And you have that silver in the flower. And just that whole combination, the kind of synergistic effect is quite stunning. The picture on the left is kind of summer color. The picture on the right is late summer, early fall color. At the Chicago Botanic Garden, they have some big plantings in their new medians and at the new Welcome Center. If you get there, check that planting out. nearly 4-season plant too in the garden. Got some motion as well. And then we have another little blue stem. This one's on the big side of things. It's called Sandhill. And Sandhill has this extra wide and more substantial foliage, almost double in size of a typical little blue stem in width. And then real beautiful powder blue foliage color. And then the stature is a little more upright as well. A lot of that foliage is on the bottom half of the plant. The top half of the plant is just these thin stems, no, not real heavily foliage. You can see that powder blue color to the plant. Going into fall, you will get some coloration, but for the most part, it's powder blue from spring to late summer. You kind of see the habit there. If you're looking for a good ground cover, Sedum Spurium Rock Candy is a good one. This one has that kind of olive green foliage with red or purple highlights on top of it. Winter color will be more on the red side. Real nice clear pink flower in June as well. These are low growing plants, just around 2 to 3 inches tall in foliage, and then the flowers are going to be right around 5 inches tall. And spreading in nature, more or less evergreen as well. Okay, we are getting close. I'm going to move a little faster. Sudzelaria brush strokes is on the kind of larger size of Sudzlarias. These are becoming very popular in the landscape trade, autumnalis especially, which is fall blooming. In the case of brush strokes, it's spring blooming. When it starts to bloom, it's maybe 18 inches, but as they mature, those stems keep getting taller and taller. And at some point, you might have stems that are 30, maybe even 36 inches tall. And so at that point, they start to have a lot of kind of movement in them. And there's a real strong separation between the foliage and the flower. And then they're starting to go to seed even. So you get this kind of real strong separation between the flowering and the foliage. You can kind of see the flowering in spring. You have yellow pollen. You have kind of that dark bud that it's coming out of, but it looks like a little brush. Then on the smaller side of Sudzelaria is my new one called Tiny Dancer. Tiny Dancer has this thin green foliage, only around 6-8 inches tall. And then the flowers are just around 10-12 inches tall, maybe a little taller as they mature. So quite little mounding clumps with the spring flowers kind of dancing above that green foliage. This would work, like a little meadow or a little matrix planting where you're planting other perennials that are smaller in stature in and around these strongly clumping green clumps, fine foliage. Solidago Sugar Kisses. This is a hybrid Solidago. So one parent is on the white side, one parent was on the gold side. The result was white petals with kind of a creamy yellow center. We have good hybrid vigor, good adaptability. In the case of Sugar Kisses, it makes a nice cut flower. So on the left, you have it in bud. It can be cut in bud, almost like a baby's breath, kind of limey yellow in color, or you can cut it in flower. Stems on this one are going to be 18, 24 inches tall. These start to bloom in July on clumping plants with kind of grassy foliage almost, and then upright stems from there. Blooming July, August, sometimes with a little rebloom too. There's a little close up. And that's in the garden with Sensilaria autumnalis. If you're familiar with lamb's ear, Stacky's little lamb is basically just a miniature form of lamb's ear. It's a new breeding from Ball. So those leaves are maybe an inch or less wide and 3 or 4 inches long, but it's going to be smaller altogether, more closer to the ground, so more of a ground cover compared to the species. And then we have a couple kind of summer flowering stackies. Summer Crush is kind of a white and pink bicolor, real good vigor, grows 24 inches tall, has that kind of pungent green crinkly foliage that is deer and rabbit resistant because of the scent. And then counterpart to that is Summer Romance. This is more on the pink side compared to Humalo. It's also a larger flower and a little more vigorous as well. So 18 to 24 inches tall. These are going to be summer blooming, so July blooming in the garden. And here they are together. We're getting close here. Vernonias are ironweeds is the common name. In the case of Southern Cross, it's a hybrid between one called Lettermanii. Lettermanii has kind of needle-like thin foliage, and the other form had a broadleaf. So the result, or the hybrid, Southern Cross, has kind of intermediate foliage. Foliage is about a ½ inch wide, long, deep green. And then in the case of Southern Cross, these are blooming purple on 3 to 4 foot stem, pretty substantial, almost shrub-like plants. Think of an Amsonia or a Baptisia. This has that similar kind of presence and size in the garden. But these are blooming late August into September. So they're late blooming plants, but real nice texture and foliage up until that point. And then when they are blooming, you have these beautiful buds. On top of that, you get these great kind of lacy purple flowers that are strongly attractive to pollinators. And after the flower, you get a beautiful seed head that's going to last all winter. And on top of that beautiful seed head, you get this chocolatey brown foliage all winter as well. So lots of winter interest, fall interest in this plant, besides the flower. And then we have a couple of Veronicas. Pure Silver has that silver foliage, but a kind of periwinkle blue flower. These are smaller statured plants, more around 15 inches tall. But that silver foliage makes like a mat in the garden. At one point, I used to cut the flower stems off when they were done, and you would just have a silver kind of ground cover on the ground. These are going to be June blooming, and makes a real nice combination just by itself. But obviously, it would combine well with other silver foliage plants. White, yellow would make a nice combination as well. And very adaptable. A lot of the Veronica incanas require sharp, dry soil. That one tolerates average to heavy soil, no problem. Many years ago, Sunny Border Blue was a common and well-known Veronica, but it had a lot of disease issues, and so it kind of trickled out of the trade. This is my kind of answer to it. Seaside has that larger foliage, that larger size in the garden. This one's going to grow about 24 inches or more tall. Foliage is larger than most of the Veronicas on the market, as are the flowers and the buds. Those flowers are over an inch wide. They start blooming at around 6 to 8 inches long, and as they mature, they get longer and longer, kind of ending up around 10 to 12 inches long, and long blooming because of that. So these are going to be kind of July blooming in the garden. And last but not least, Veronicastrum, Queen of Diamonds. This is another one of those plants that is a great native plant in nature or in the prairie, but when you bring it into horticulture and try to produce it under irrigation and propagate it by cuttings or seed, you tend to have a lot of disease issues. So I selected Queen of Diamonds for this cleaner foliage, a little darker as well. Spring emergence, it has that kind of cinnamon bronze color to it. And then the flower color has a little pink to it too. Not so typical of the white species. They bloom July into August. And then going into winter, you have a nice kind of skeleton in the garden. These plants are going to grow 4 foot tall in maturity. And those seed heads and those stems and that foliage going to turn chocolatey brown for fall into winter and stand up all winter. As Roy Diblick would say, it dies incredibly beautifully. And I want to say thank you for your time, and I'm happy to answer some questions.
Does honeycomb require full sun?
Pretty much, yes. It's a full sun plant. Those are kind of native to open, that species, I should say. Dracylus would be native to kind of open areas where it's gravelly or dry soil. And so that's what they're going to want. They're not going to tolerate shade very well.
Does flower tower spread?
So it does spread a little. I think it can even spread by seed, but I wouldn't call it aggressively spreading. You know, one way to kind of worry less about that is to put it in a mature garden. Then there's a lot less opportunity for it to spread.